NASA's next spacecraft, already being built and tested across America, will do those things and more.
This is the spacecraft that's going to take humans to explore the solar system. It's the next big step for NASA in exploration.
Called the Orion Multipurpose Crew Vehicle, or MPCV, this next-generation spacecraft will enable America to explore beyond low Earth orbit, beyond low Earth orbit, beyond low Earth orbit.
Have a listen to what some NASA experts have to say about this topic.
As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Hang on. So what you're saying is that in order to send humans through this region, we need to solve the challenge of getting through the Van Allen radiation belts. But I'm confused. Didn't you already solve this challenge back in 1969 when you sent astronauts to the moon and subsequently 5 other times after that?
But we're also really pushing the boundaries in terms of where we're going forward with exploration. I think humans are naturally driven to do this, and this is really the beginning, I think, of human beings leaving low Earth orbit. I certainly plan on being around to see that.
So she's a NASA astronaut, but I guess no one bothered to tell her about the first time that we left low Earth orbit. I guess she might be a little too young to remember. Here we have another astronaut that wasn't told about the moon landing 48 years ago.
The plan that NASA has is to build a rocket called SLS, which is a heavy lift rocket. It's something that is much bigger than what we have today, and it will be able to launch the Orion capsule with humans on board, as well as landers or other components to destinations beyond Earth orbit. Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. We only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. And this new system that we're building is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans into the solar system to explore. So the moon, Mars, asteroids, there's a lot of destinations that we could go to, and we're building these building block components in order to allow us to do that eventually.
Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin were a tough bunch of SOBs able to withstand all that brutal radiation, considering these challenges are still yet to be solved. So how is it that we had the technology to achieve this amazing feat back in 1969, but we're still working on the technology in 2017, almost half a century later? Well, I managed to find a very clever and well-informed astronaut that will totally straighten things out for us and explain exactly why we're not able to return to the moon and break through those Van Allen radiation belts. Have a listen to this clever chap.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
This guy, oh boy.
And unlike the previous program, we are setting a course with specific and achievable milestones. Early in the next decade, a set of crewed flights will test and prove the systems required for exploration beyond low Earth orbit.
Low Earth orbit is supposedly between 99 and 1,200 miles away. The funny thing is that they say the moon is over 200,000 miles away. How did we make it so far in the 1960s?
Other than the alleged Apollo trips, all other manned spacecraft have stayed below the belts. These belts do not officially begin until an altitude of 1,000 miles is reached. But when one space shuttle crew was brave enough to go nearly 400 miles above the Earth, they started to experience some unusual effects. They reported seeing shooting stars, which were a result of the radiation hitting the retinas of their eyes.
And if I'd have landed 20 feet behind where I landed, we'd have landed right smack in that crater.
When interviewed, Alan Bean of Apollo 12 initially stated that he had not gone through the belts and did not observe any effects caused by them.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts? No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
When it was pointed out that the flight pattern took him through the belts, he changed his story.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
We went right out through them.
No effects on your cells?
We didn't even know it. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody said you went through the radiation belt, but we didn't feel it.
Some scientists argue that the trip through the belts was so brief, that is only a few hours, that the radiation would not have had a negative effect on the astronauts. But the question remains, if these belts are not dangerous, why in the last 30 years has absolutely no country put even a monkey past these belts? The standard excuse is that no one has wanted to spend the money to do so. But to write off every advanced country in the world as too stingy and incompetent in over a third of a century to explore further than 400 miles from Earth really is a bit too much to fathom. It is more likely that we simply do not have the technology to go further at this time.
Let's start with the first question being, what led you to start to question the moon landings in general?
Well, my father was in the Air Force, so I grew up around aviation. And when they allegedly walked on the moon in 1969, I was 4.5 years old. I was asleep in bed. And my father, being an officer, he got a VIP package of 9x12 color pictures of the Apollo 11 mission. And I had about 15 and 20 of these on my bedroom wall for about 10 years. Then at the age of 14, I saw a news magazine program on with William Casey. He was a former NASA contractor during the Apollo program. He was one of the few people who saw the entire picture. Part of the way they keep classified information a secret is they departmentalize it, but he had to proof all of these memos between the departments, and therefore he was one of the few people who saw the whole picture. He alleged that they did not go to the moon in 1969 because it was impossible, and because Kennedy had set a goal that he could not achieve, and rather than admitting the United States had bitten off more than they could chew, they bluffed like a good poker player who had a bad hand to convince the Soviet Union that we had good strategic capability during the height of the Cold War. It was also a very good pep rally during the Vietnam War. Tricky Dick Nixon was president, and he said that the Vietnam War protests were the #1 cause subverting America, not, foreign enemies. He considered domestic citizens to be enemies of the country. So this was something to cheer about. I think, whoever did 9/11, whether it was really Muslim terrorists or domestic people, there's still 3,000 people dead. Whoever killed JFK, he's still dead. However, the moon landing conspiracy is the only positive conspiracy, and it's really hard to get people to give that up. It's like telling somebody your favorite team who won the Super Bowl, they cheated in order to win. They're not interested in hearing it. I first heard about this at age 14 and caught me as an open-minded individual. So after the program where I saw William Casey on, I went to my bedroom wall, looked at the pictures, and kind of like my eyes were wide shut the whole time, I started seeing things that he was talking about. That planted a seed in my mind. I was really pondering it in the back of my mind for about 10 years. At age 24, I'd become a filmmaker, and one day I was editing videos for the man who had actually produced the program I had seen 10 years earlier as a 14-year-old. And I said, well, do you remember the guy in your TV program who said we didn't go to the moon? He says, no, but call the San Francisco office. I called about 3 days before they threw away all 10-year-old files, tracked him down, and he suggested that I make a moon film about it, about how they didn't go to the moon. I try to take people at their word. Believe it or not, I'm really not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just looking for the truth. And I considered it a possibility that indeed the moon landings were fraudulent. At first, I turned down the project, figuring, if they really didn't go, and me being kind of a relentless personality who likes puzzles, it could be dangerous looking into it. So I originally turned down the project. Then, after about 5 years went by, I realized, well, everyone's going to die anyway. And if they didn't go to the moon, this is a really significant event in human history. I mean, think about it, Sean. Let's say on one hand, they could go to the moon. They could plant a flag on this lifeless rock with 1960s technology, even though they can't repeat it today. Or the other possibility is they couldn't do it. They lied about it. They murdered people to keep it a secret. They embezzled billions of dollars. So what we have here, if the moon landings are indeed fake, and I know for a fact that they are, that is actually more significant of an event historically than if they had actually gone. So what we have is one of the greatest events in human history, which is the faking of the moon landing because of a flaw in our character as a human race, and this great truth is being withheld from mankind. So, I wish it were a theory. 3.5 years into this 5-year project, if a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, I still gave them the benefit of the doubt. But I said, there's at least a 1 out of 4 chance that they didn't go. 3.5 years into it, I pop in this tape that had never before been seen. It says at the beginning of it, do not show to the public, and it's the only unedited reel that I had at that point received from NASA. Everything was pre-washed, pre-assembled for the news media. This was the same shot for an hour of them allegedly showing the Earth floating in space, and you'll see from the film it's a completely contrived 1-foot model of the Earth, proving that they were on the rocket, but they never left Earth orbit. They faked everything beyond that. And these people who say, well, maybe they went to the moon to commune with aliens, and that's why these pictures are fake. The fact is, if you really could go to the moon, you would go, and you wouldn't fake any of it for fear it would be exposed. So NASA or the government or whoever it is, they don't care why you believe that the United States has a capability to go to the moon, as long as you do. If you believe it has something to do with UFOs or aliens or whatever, they don't care, as long as you believe that the missions are real.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with a TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
Blue cast, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away?
I know that one of the main evidence that people allege as why it's impossible to go to the moon, they say the Van Allen radiation belt would be the radiation presented by passing through that belt would be too powerful, even though astrophysicists and others have dismissed that notion and that theory. Is that what your main hypothesis rests upon, that it's impossible to pass it?
Well, it's not a hypothesis. It's a fact they didn't go. You can see from the movie, we have unedited footage of Neil Armstrong on camera faking being halfway to the moon. Prior to that, it was a theory. Now it's not. Now there's a number of reasons why they couldn't go. First of all, you have to understand that no great accomplishment of this kind has ever been done, ever, on the first attempt. The first time the Wright brothers tried to go up, they didn't go up. It was on their 20th, 30th, who knows how many attempts. The first time Mount Everest tried to be climbed, you think they made it? No, they died. The first time they tried to go to the South Pole, they died. When Edison tried to invent the light bulb, you think he got it the first time? It was over 1,000 times before he got it right. To say that they went to the moon with 1960s technology on the very first attempt is illogical. Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927. It wouldn't be 50 years before any nation on Earth again flew an airplane over the Atlantic. I mean, when Columbus went to the New World, it was within a year or two that everyone went to the New World. Lewis and Clark went west. Within a half a year, everyone went west. And we're to believe that they can go to the moon so easily with 1960s technology, and it cannot be repeated for 50 years. It defies logic. The problem is you're trying to take candy away from a baby. You're trying to tell someone who believes in Santa Claus that it's not real. It's the only conspiracy I know of that gives people a good feeling. It's a good conspiracy. People do not want to give that up. Now, in regard to the radiation, I can tell you this. In December of last year, they sent up a rocket called the Orion Project. It goes up 3,600 miles, makes a U-turn, and comes back. Well, when you go to the store and you take a U-turn and come back, your destination is the store. So when they go up 3,600 miles and U-turn, their destination is 3,600 miles. So what is at 3,600 miles? The Van Allen radiation belt. Most people don't know this, but every manned flight in human history was well below this radiation that starts at about 1,000 miles up and extends about 25,000 miles beyond that. The only time a human is said to have gone through the radiation is to the moon and back. Well, NASA produced, and you can show it, this great promotional video about Orion where Kelly Smith, a 20-ish engineer from the project, says that they are going up to test this dangerous radiation. And then he says, we must first solve these dangerous radiation problems before we send people through this region of space. Now, wait a minute. NASA just admitted that the technology does not yet exist to send people through the Van Allen radiation belt. So how is it that they did it 19 times nearly 50 years ago and not one astronaut got cancer, not even radiation sickness? They just admitted indirectly that they did not go to the moon. So I contacted NASA as a journalist and I said, hey, you had 2 Geiger counters, on board this unmanned Orion vehicle. Why not send me the information from the Geiger counters and tell me what were the radiation readings in this radiation? They said that information is classified. I said, oh, wait a minute. You send up probes that taxpayers funded to the sun, and the temperature of the sun, that's not a secret. And you send probes up to, Mars or Jupiter, and how much helium is in the atmosphere of Jupiter, that's not a secret. So why would the amount of radiation in the radiation belts, which are just a part of nature, be a secret? There's no reason for that unless it proves that the moon landings were fraudulent. And that's why that information is classified.
So one of the arguments that has been made, obviously, is that there was a moon landing, but it was then, because again, as you mentioned before, because of the some kind of alien presence or some kind of desire to keep secret that which was discovered, alien artifacts even on the moon, they basically had to stage it in order to recreate it for mainstream consumption. You don't buy that at all?
That makes no sense at all to me, because if you're really going to the moon and already people are doubting whether you really can and might be faking it, the last thing you would do would be faking any of it, because then people would say, hey, look, this picture's fake, which means the whole missions were fake. If you could go to the moon, you would show it, and you would also, if you were faking it, you would go as far as the point where you had to fake it. For example, let's say they could have landed on the moon, but for some reason they couldn't get out. The spacesuits didn't work. Well, they would have made it real up to landing and faked the walk. Let's say you could orbit the moon and not land. Then they would have done it real to orbiting the moon to get the real pictures and then faked landing and beyond. But what we have is them faking being halfway to the moon. Simply leaving Earth orbit, this tape shows them faking being halfway to the moon. In fact, you can hear the CIA on a 3rd channel of audio. According to NASA, there's only Houston, Control, and the astronauts on this channel. But there's clearly a 3rd channel on there of a completely different EQ, crystal clear. And when NASA says, hey, the TV picture looks great, there's exactly 4 seconds of dead air. After the 4 seconds go by, we hear this 3rd party say, talk. And then Neil Armstrong starts speaking. You see, he was supposed to be halfway to the moon, and light speed going out and coming back, and the increased delay because of all the analog computer equipment, there would be at least a 4-second delay. He was really only 200 miles above the Earth, so he could hear them and respond immediately. But if he did that, it would give away that he was close to the Earth. That's why he had an earpiece in, and someone with a stopwatch, after NASA asked the question, counted off 4 seconds. And then they said, talk. Don't speak until 4 seconds go by. They were trying to create this radio delay. I mean, proof of the faking is right there. Then we see the shot of the Earth, you know, that's really the window.
Yeah,
I can tell you, looking at a picture, was this shot with sunlight or was it shot with artificial light? You know, the sun is so bright on the moon, 20 times brighter than here on Earth because of no atmosphere. So the very last thing you're going to need is electrical lighting, plus all the, you know, setup and batteries and all that stuff. You have more sunlight than you know what to do with. And just, you know, your listeners and watchers, just go out on high noon, you know, when no clouds in the sky, and stand about 3 feet apart from your friend. You'll see that your shadows go in the same direction. No matter where you stand, no matter where you turn, the shadows will always be parallel with one another. But in several of these pictures, which you can see, and a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, the shadows intersect, sometimes by as much as 90 degrees. That's completely impossible if they are in sunlight, which they were not. They were in electrical lighting. I can even tell you, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, although it might be just a hair before your time, they used to use umbrella lights. Maybe they don't really use them a lot anymore, but they would try to soften the light by bouncing a light into a reflective umbrella. And I was using them at the time I first started making this movie, but I go, that's an umbrella light. You can see fill light, even though the guy's in a complete dark shadow on the opposite side of the sun of the lunar module. I mean, they're filming the door, him coming out allegedly on the moon for the first time. The sun's on the opposite side. It should be pitch black. There's no, you know, additional lighting of any kind, allegedly, according to them. And yet he's, you know, you can see every detail on the astronaut's suit. It's simply not true. And then this National Geographic special is so amazing. You can see this on my YouTube channel. They go out to a desert at night, and right before that they say, well, we can't replicate, you know, the high temperature of sunlight. I'm like, you can't? And they go out to a desert at night, put up a big electrical light, and they have a guy, you know, dressed in an astronaut suit, and a guy stand behind or beside him, and they say, see, the, you know, the shadows intersect, therefore the moon landings must be real. Now wait a minute. Didn't they light the thing with electrical light and say that replicated the pictures that were taken on the moon? Doesn't that make it fake rather than real? Why didn't they just wait 12 hours, go to the same desert during the day, and photograph 2 people standing beside one another with the sun that was supposed to be on the moon? It's just the most amazing thing. They're actually proving that the moon landings were fake, all the while lying and telling you that they're real. They put an electrical light out, had 2 people stand beside one another, and said, see, the shadows intersect, therefore the moon missions are real. But that's the very point that proves that they were fake, because it was lit with electrical light, you know, which, depending on whether you're on the left-hand side of it or the right-hand side of it, it will cast shadows in different directions. I just can't believe this. The very logic and proof that proved the moon missions were fake, they turned it around and said, no, that's what proves it's real. And people bought that.
If this was then fake, do you believe the theory that it was Stanley Kubrick, who shot the moon landing?
I would say that's a very good theory for a number of reasons. Number one, the moon landings were fake. So they could either hire the media director at the Pentagon and get great security and amateur results, or they could hire the best filmmaker on the planet and get great results short term and worry about security later. That had to be the decision they had to have made. And what a coincidence. Stanley Kubrick was the greatest filmmaker on the planet at the time, shooting a film about going to the moon, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it's a fact, Von Braun and the flight director visited the closed sets of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then, I'm sure a lot of people have seen it in the movie The Shining, there's allegedly all these clues about him hinting at the moon landings being fake, the greatest of which is the little Danny Redrum boy who gets up from an outline of the pad there at Cape Canaveral with a shirt on that says Apollo 11, and he walks to a door with the room 237 on it, which was changed because that represented 237,000 miles away, average distance at that time, believed, from the Earth to the moon. There's no doubt, I believe, that he did it. Additionally, he stipulated in his contract of his very last film, interestingly named Eyes Wide Shut, because people can see a picture of a man on the moon and not see all the obvious reasons why the picture is fake. And he insisted contractually that that film open on a particular date. Even if he were to predecease the date, it would have to be carried out. That date was July 16th, 1999. The 30th anniversary of the moon missions is when he insisted that Eyes Wide Shut open. Yes, I believe that he did it. There's no proof of that, but that's a very, very good theory, and it's very likely true.
But what was the motivation for this fake landing? Was it to sort of triumph American exceptionalism in the world and to obviously feed the industry around NASA and whatnot? So explain what the motivation for the success of the moon landing would have been if it was fake.
Well, it's one of the oldest reasons in the book, pride. Kennedy, who was a visionary, not a scientist, put the goal to go to the moon by the end of the 1960s, only a few days after the U.S. went in space with a man for the very first time, not even achieving a single orbit. They just went up for 15 minutes from Florida to California. Kennedy said, hey, let's put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. When that goal proved to be impossible, they just decided to bluff. Like in a game of poker, they would not eat humble pie and admit that we had bitten off more than we could chew. Plus, it was a great way for friends in the military-industrial complex to make money. It was a good distraction during the Vietnam War, give something, to feel good about for the average American citizen, to be prideful about. I mean, putting a man on the moon, if it were true, would be physically the single greatest accomplishment in mankind. Now that we know that it's not, it's probably the most gigantic, deplorable lie ever told by the country that claims to be a light on a hill, the rescuer of everybody, the promoter of democracy and truth and justice. It's terrible.
Beyond, obviously, you've talked about the notion of profiteering that went on with NASA and how they swelled this budget, obviously, with everything from the rockets themselves and the research that went into it, even to the rovers costing far too much money for what it should have cost in comparison. But do you think that you still don't believe that there's a possibility that some of that money went into what's called black projects or black programs, whereby when people allege, for example, that there's underground facilities, that there's much higher orders of technology that you yourself talked about, UFOs being man-made, government-made perhaps, that we're then talking about a breakaway civilization or a potentially far more technologically advanced civilization that is operating behind the auspices of our government than what has been admitted? You don't think that that's possible?
Oh, it's definitely possible and probably is the way that it is. However, I think the greater concern isn't about how much their technology might be, 30 years ahead of the commercial industry, which, is impressive, but not all that impressive. What's more concerned is that there are two governments. There's the, the face government, and then there's the, 10 or 12 people who are above the president telling the president what to do, telling Congress and the Senate what to do. I mean, the Congress and the Senate, they weren't, inquired to about whether or not we should fake the moon missions. They knew nothing about it. So what we have here is our elected officials are not the people running the government. That's of greater concern.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I can't imagine that he was debriefed and that kind of question wasn't asked. What he saw, what he felt, what he experienced while on the moon. And now listen to Mike Collins, who was sitting to the left of Neil Armstrong.
I don't remember seeing any. Neil, you were a little bit concerned, you said about...
So now Mike doesn't remember seeing any stars either. We have to remember that the reporter asked about them looking up at the sky and if they could see the stars based on the circumstances. So Mike Collins' answer has got to apply to his experience in the command module itself because he didn't walk on the moon or go down to its surface. But let's look again at Neil's response to what Mike said.
I don't remember seeing any. Neil, you were a little bit concerned, you said about...
Notice his body language, and it looks like Neil even whispers something under his breath to Mike. Was he telling him to simply shut up? I don't know, but the interaction looks really odd to me. All right, here is another interview with Neil Armstrong. And right after I show you this quick piece, I'll immediately share a few more statements made by other astronauts who shared what they could or couldn't see while in outer space.
Mr. Armstrong, I do realize that when you were on the moon, you had very little time for gazing upwards. But could you tell us something about what the sky actually looks like from the moon, the sun, the earth, the stars, if any, and so on?
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. The Earth is the only visible object other than the sun that can be seen, although there have been some reports of seeing planets. I myself did not see planets from the surface, but I suspect they might be visible.
Whilst
from
in
Mark
space,
Cameron. This is from Mark Cameron.
Whilst in space, have you ever looked away from Earth into the black void?
Yeah. So because you can see, you can see the stars.
Oh yeah.
You know, and pretty much all the time you can see the stars.
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon.
Space, and you're on the sun side of the orbit. The sunlight washes out all the starlight, so you can't see any stars, just like here on Earth.
There's all the stars there, and the cool thing is about it, you can see it during the day.
Yeah, you can, and there's more than stars. You can see planets. You can see moons.
You see the gas Magellan clouds of the
you
Milky
see
Way galaxy. Pretty much all the time you can see the stars.
Then when you look out into deep space away from the sun, it's the darkest black you can imagine.
So this black space you're looking at on your screen right now could or couldn't be what you see when viewing outer space from outer space. I guess you have to go to outer space or